We're ready to go. Thanks for coming out. Vi and Ned Coffin used to do this, used to do a whole series in August, 4 Wednesday nights. And when they got older, they decided they didn't want to do it anymore. And this democratic engagement on issues and so on has continued at least once a year in August. We do a very sweet gubernatorial debate. I think we've had the last 2 rounds, 16 and 18, and it usually is a pretty interesting, productive discussion. Of course, now we have maybe the next governor with us today for a conversation. He didn't know that was a surprise. Anyway, I want to salute Vi and Ned for using this amazing, beautiful house in the way it was really intended to be used. Now, downcountry people have a notion about Vermonters being kind of rural and backward and so on. And so it happens occasionally, even in our democracy, even in our quaint, iconic town meetings. So they come up from downcountry and figure, we're a little different. We can probably get away with something up here in Vermont. So a couple of counterfeiters showed up in Hardwick, and the bills they had just minted were $18 bills, and they decided they would see if they could pass them off on the general store owner there, and they said, "Can you change an 18 for us?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. Would you like 3 6s or 2 9s?" Anyway, so we're going to start. I'm going to introduce Jim. Then I've got a bunch of set questions, but he's going to give some introductory remarks, and I've asked him to not go on forever, only because there's a little bit of a sequence to the questions that I tried to compose about everything from Russian hacking to what's special about Vermont democracy. But he's served now, he's in his 5th term as Vermont Secretary of State. He's got a wonderful private business background prior to that with a regulated utility, a family-owned $30 million distribution company, and other private endeavors. He served for maybe 20 years on the Burlington City Council.
South Burlington, six terms, 18 years. 18
years, and after that, 4 terms in the Vermont State Senate, which incidentally, we were just talking about legislative pay and how small it is. His district in Chittenden County has 6 senators. So he represents 6 times as many people as Carl Demeraux. No, actually 3 times, because you're in a 2-person district, right?
Well, Senate House is 15 times. Senate average House district is about 44.
This is way above my pay grade. I'm sorry.
Average Senate's about 21,000.
Anyway, it's a labor of love, and it's hard to get by on, I would say, the average legislator earns for their 5 months of work and their innumerable hours in the off-season, probably earns, what, Mark, 14,000 maybe in a year? We're pretty darn lucky to have Senator McDonald with us, retired Representative Patsy French, Carl Demeraux, who represents the Horseshoe District that includes Corinth and Washington and Williamstown. What else? Jeez. Any other electeds here? Hey, Jim. You too. Jim worked with me when I was Secretary of State back in the early Pleistocene on this Doing Democracy booklet, which were ways that we could enhance town meeting in Vermont years ago. Thank you for that service. He was at that time the chair of the League of Cities and Towns. Amazing. So, Jim, what have I left out of your impressive public-private resume?
Well, Patsy has something she'd like to say.
You know what you left out? You know what I'm going to say?
Yes, I do.
Yellow rain hat man at Gutterson Fieldhouse for you. Oh my gosh,
And when I first talked to Howard Dean, I told him, see, I can lead thousands. That's right.
So back in the day, the Secretary of State used to produce a hard copy of a book that had legislative bio sketches. So you could find out if you went to the legislature who you were going to talk with in each of the committees. The only thing I ever achieved as Secretary of State was to make sure this book was on legislators' desks the first week that they were there so that it would have some use. Prior to my arrival as Secretary of State, it didn't get there till March. By then you knew everybody, you already had an opinion about them, and nobody ever read the darn thing. So that was my only achievement. Where is it now? It's online. So
The legislature took it over.
this is the last one of them, produced by Jim Condos, and I love it. It has all the stuff that you need, all the pertinent details.
In fairness, there is a statute that also requires us to do a more in-depth one that includes local government and stuff, but that's not done until the end of this year, the end of the first year of the biennium. So there is a hard copy coming out.
There is a hard copy, and it has all the election results and a whole bunch of other good information. But anyway, Jim says that his priorities as Secretary of State are improving agency technologies, which desperately needed. When I was Secretary, all the business records were kept on index cards in shoeboxes. Prior to my arrival, I didn't improve it much. He's doing that. Transparency in government, he's on the business identity theft task force for the National Association of Secretaries of State, which he has just concluded being president of. So he's familiar with the secretaries in all the other states of the country, and I'm hoping will share with us how Republicans deal with the voter suppression efforts of their party. He's been on the following committees: elections, presidential primary, voter participation, business services. This guy's been around the block. Committee on overseas and military voting initiatives, and then he's on a ton of boards of Chittenden County Solid Waste, and on and on. He's a masterful public servant, a great guy, and maybe future governor. Jim, thank you.
Thanks for the wonderful kudos coming out. I will say that in my day as a city councilor in South Burlington, I was known as a man of many hats because I'd been on the Regional Planning Commission, the Metropolitan Planning Commission, the CCTA bus service, solid waste district. I'd pretty much done everything that there was in Chittenden County before I became a senator. I also served at VLCT, Jim Maslin, VLCT Executive Committee. I was on that, and I was on the National League of Cities Executive Committee as well. So I've had a lot of local, state, and national perspective. I like to start things off by just saying, where did I come from? All four of my grandparents came to the United States from Greece, all four of them. My grandfathers came around 1900. They went back a few years later and picked up their wives and brought them over. Both of my parents and their siblings were all born here in the United States. And they've served their communities in a number of roles as well. My cousins, I have a cousin who's a dentist in New York City. I have a cousin who's a performing arts director in New York City. I have a cousin who was the mayor of Seaside Heights, New Jersey, and he's now a police officer there. He was on the police department and didn't like how the city was running, so he ran for mayor, got that, stepped off the police department, now he's back. And it goes on and on and on, but I always like to tell the story about when my father, when I first got involved and was elected to the South Burlington City Council, my dad shows up at my swearing in, and he's got tears coming down his face, and told me how proud my grandfathers would be. And then when I got sworn in as a state senator, he was visibly crying. We always joked that a towel wasn't going to be good enough, we need to give him a sheet. And then when I got sworn in as Secretary of State, it was clear that he was proud, but he didn't say a whole lot. And on the way back to the airport, at the time, both of my parents were living in Florida, and I was taking them back to the airport, and my father's sitting in the front seat with me, and he leans over and he says, does this mean you now work for Hillary? And I said, no, Dad, different secretary. A couple more miles, and he turns to me and he goes, do I have to call you Mr. Secretary from now on? And I said, no, Dad, you've always called me Jim or son, that'll suffice. And he smacks me on the back of the head and says, don't get cocky. So, as I tell people often, I'm a proud second-generation American and proud of my heritage. It's what I see happening right now across this country is really disturbing to me. That I can't even believe that people think the way that some of these folks are thinking. But it's America was built by immigrants. America is immigrants. That's who we are, and that's who we will be. So in any case, why don't we get right into it?
What a beautiful self-introduction. I had the great privilege to be a Howard Dean delegate in Boston in 2004. That was the Cary Convention, and I was there in the audience at North Station, or the whatever the Bruins barn is called now, when Obama introduced himself to the country. He wasn't even a U.S. senator at that point. Billy, do you remember what happened the next morning? Patrick Leahy had our little Vermont 17-person delegation have Obama for breakfast. 17 of us had breakfast with Obama. He was sitting from me to Mark, and he was standing at the podium. And he was running at that time for Illinois U.S. Senate from Illinois. He hadn't even been elected, and that was in 2004. But it was a I'm an immigrant and you welcomed me, just the same introduction that you just gave, Jim.
So another Obama story, though?
Yes.
So my partner, Annie Noonan, and we had a 9-pound Yorkie at the time. She had gone down to see her niece in Washington, and I was there for a conference. But she had to come back a day earlier than I was, and as she gets on the airplane, she strolls by Barack Obama, who was then a senator, but was going to, let me think now. Yes, he was a senator, and he was going to come speak for Bernie, who was running for the Senate in Vermont. And she said, Senator, I'm so pleased to see you and meet you on your way to Vermont. It's a wonderful state. And she walked back, and a few minutes later she walked back to the front, and she said, I'm not stalking you, but my seat's right next to you. So she got to sit next to him all the way back to Burlington, and she had our Yorkie in a carryall underneath the seat. And while they were chit-chatting, all of a sudden, the Yorkie, so Barack looked at her and said, what was that? And, oh, that's just my dog. Well, can you bring him out? You're a senator, I guess so. So she brought the dog out, and our dog licked Barack Obama's nose. That's our claim to fame.
And if you still got nostalgia for Obama, there's an immense, wonderful, beautiful coffee table book, a picture book, by the official White House photographer. What's his name, Allison?
Pete Souza.
Pete Souza, yes. It is magnificent. It will uplift your day, and it's a great gift for somebody you really care about. And such a nice memory of better times. So, Jim, if voting mattered, wouldn't they make it illegal? So I want to
It
know.
does matter, and it is legal.
Okay. So what's the state of Vermont's democracy? Give it a grade, and tell us if we've got any shortcomings that need to be overcome.
I would say first that we are probably an A, and I say that because I have some facts behind that. MIT does after every general election they do a kind of a recap. It's all data driven. They go to all the states, all 50 states, and get the data. And in 2012, which would have been my first election, or first election that I was managing, we were ranked 38th in the nation. After the 2014 election, and by the way, like for instance, we haven't seen the numbers for the 18, we won't until next year, probably right around May or June. So it's about an 18-month lag. So after 2014, we'd gone from 38th to 14. And then after 16, we went from 14 to number 1. So we are number 1 in the nation. And it's because many of the initiatives that I have proposed to the legislature, that the legislature has agreed with and pushed forward, things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, allowing 17-year-olds to vote in Vermont if in a primary, if they'll be 18 by the general election. In my first election for Secretary of State, my opponent, who's now the governor's chief of staff, opposed allowing 17-year-olds. And he used to say so on the stump, but he stopped after a while because I kept reminding the same people that he was talking to that, are you trying to say that students can't vote because they're not educated enough? I said, there's probably a lot of adults who would fit that description as well. We don't have an education requirement in this country. That was taken out in the 60s by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that obviously that constitutional amendment passed 81% to 19% and was wholeheartedly accepted by the state. We now park 16-year-olds who are getting their license because of automatic voter registration. If they're getting their license at 16, the next time they get their license renewed won't be until they're 20 because it's a 4-year license. And so we now park those people off to the side until their birth date comes up as meeting the requirements, and then we pre-register them. Now there's good news and bad news about that. We now have one of the highest in the nation percentage of eligible Vermonters who are registered to vote. We're in the mid-90s. The organization, conservative organization called Judicial Watch, doesn't like that. So they've been going around the country suing states, and we're expecting a lawsuit at some point because we happen to think it's the right thing to do to make sure that anybody that's eligible is registered. And we hope that, because of things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and online voter registration, that we have a high percentage. That's a good thing from my standpoint.
Well, I would certainly endorse that. I don't think you get ownership of democracy and people fulfilling their civic responsibilities and all that stuff unless they feel like it matters and unless they're participants. So what is the rationale behind Judicial Watch to keep them out of the system? Poor people, they don't want to vote because they'll vote Democrat?
Well, they're afraid that they think that the more people that will vote Democrat. This is the ongoing discussion about voter suppression around the country. It's why they are making it more and more difficult. Scott Walker in Wisconsin pushed through. They did not have voter ID. He pushed through a very strict voter ID, but said But you should like this because it's free to the voter. Yeah, but you had to go to the DMV. So what did he do in his DMV budgets? He cut those budgets to the point where they were closing DMV offices around their state. So people were now having to travel 100 to 200 miles to get to a DMV in order to get a free ID. Also, a lot of times what happens is that people are required to produce a birth certificate. There's a lot of people in this country that don't have available their birth certificate. And guess what? That costs money to go get it. So that's kind of like a poll tax in essence, and that was done away with in the 60s as well. So there's a lot of concern about what's going on around the country, and I've seen it up firsthand as I've traveled in my role as president.
So there are four numbers that I always used to think were relevant. Number one is the population of Vermont, that Governor Scott has complained has been stagnant, and therefore we're at full employment, and businesses that want to grow can't find worthy workers and so on. So anyway, you've got the state population. Then you've got the number of the percentage of that population that is over the age of 18. What do you think that is? 75%?
Well, let's see, it's 6,000 students, or 6,000 students per grade, K through 12, so that's 13 times 6. We figure it's about 520,000 people are eligible.
I see. Then you want to know what percentage of those eligibles over 18 are registered. You just said 90%. That's pretty damn cool. And then you want to know how many of those registereds actually vote. That's the really crucial number. How many?
And we're in the top 10 or so in the country. I think after 18 we were, I think, 11th in the nation, but it's about 58% roughly. And don't forget, that's a non-presidential year. Presidential year, we usually go up about 10 points. So we'll be about 65 to 70% for the presidential year coming up.
So then that translates, let's say it's an extremely close election. I don't think that this one will be in Vermont, but a really cliffhanger. If you got 68%, that's 34% voted for the winner and 33% voted for the loser. So, I mean, it's just something to keep in mind when you say, well, Obama had this big majority. He didn't. He had about 24% of Americans ended up voting for him. So that's just something. When we look back and say, well, that guy had a landslide, it was way less than 50% of those people who could have voted actually did.
And I think this is probably a good time to bring up, back around, what was it, 1920, we passed the equal rights voting for women, and that's 100 years ago, and I think, Billy, you said it was today? 1919 today. So women were given the right to vote.
That's so cool.
And it's, and then of course, we've had, it's kind of interesting. If you look back over history, when this country was first formed, the only people that could vote were white male landowners. They were the only ones that could vote. Since that time, we have had about 10 amendments to the Constitution and 3 voter rights acts, which have been nothing but expanding the right to vote to people, to different groups, and making it easier. What we saw in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party, and they hit the secretaries of state hard. I publicly faulted DNC for ignoring the Secretary of State races just prior to the redistricting.
Democratic National Committee.
Sorry. So there was essentially, I had called during my race, and I had said to the Democratic National Committee, you know, what are you doing to help secretaries of state? And they, well, we don't go below governor. That's as far down as we go. And I said, well, you do realize that redistricting is up in the next 2 years. And they said, no, we're not worried about it. They should have been, if you see what happened across this country. So, there was an interesting thing we posted on our Twitter feed. Essentially, these different gerrymandered districts across the country, you could actually find one that would spell a letter or look like a letter of our alphabet for every one. There were so many gerrymandered districts, and and to be fair, both sides have done it, but we really need to get away from that.
Jim and I had the good fortune to be on a panel on new initiatives recently, and we were invited by Barbarina Heyerdahl in Montpelier to sit with Deb Markowitz and learn about what the activities of the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Goodman was a civil rights worker in 1964 who was assassinated in the Deep South, along with 2 African American who were registering voters in Mississippi. It took the FBI almost 2 months to track down their bodies. Anyway, President Johnson at that time really insisted that it be a full-scale, full-scale hunt for the murderers and so on. Well, Goodman's younger brother today, David, has re-energized their family foundation. And what do?
Well, they look to help candidates. They look, not directly. Oops, sorry. They look to help get the right people in office without directly impacting, not without making contributions directly. Right.
But they have chosen, interestingly, in the Rust Belt and in the Deep South, any district where the incumbent congressperson won by less amount, fewer votes, than the student population in the district. So they have gone on campuses, especially African American campuses in the Deep South, and organized like crazy. They install an organizer to work and support, make a family out of these new voters, sort of going back to your point about trying to increase the franchise. And it is such a cool initiative. Totally legal, of course, and we'll see how well they do. But it's called the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Look them up. They've got a beautiful website, and I am a huge fan of these new voters and whether or not they're going to turn out in 2020.
And let me just say, to follow that up, right now, the thing that we're getting the most pushback from conservatives around the country is early absentee voting and student voting. Those are the 2 things that they're most afraid of. They don't like the fact that people can actually have a ballot and fill it out early before election day, because their claim is you don't know who's filling it out. Well, I will say, and I will say this till I'm gone, widespread voter fraud is a myth. We don't have a problem with voter fraud. Are there occasional cases of it? Absolutely. In many cases, it's just a mistake on someone's part. They thought they were registered or that they could register or whatever. There's a woman in Texas that's been sent to jail for 5 years, and she was not aware that she couldn't vote because she had a felony, had served her time, and was out, and she thought she was reinstated, but she wasn't. So it's just a real issue. And by the way, you can be proud here in Vermont, we're one of 2 states, us and Maine, where convicted felons and incarcerated individuals who have a Vermont residence as their base residence are still allowed to vote. nowhere else in the country at this point.
Jim, you've anticipated so many questions at school. Tell us about election fraud. Does it exist? Is it widespread? Is voter suppression real? What was President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission all about? What were its findings?
There were no findings because they ended up disbanding. The Maine Secretary of State, Democrat, was on the committee as well, on the commission, and he sued the commission because, and Chris Kobach, who was the famous Kansas Secretary of State, king of voter suppression, but he sued the commission because he, as a member of the commission, was not being given information that the Republicans on the committee were. And he ended up winning, and the next day after the court overturned or said that he was entitled to it, Trump disbanded the organization.
Kobach ran in 2018 for governor of Kansas and had the improbable outcome of being defeated in Kansas.
A red state.
Yeah.
And then he was also sued, as he was still a Secretary of State, by the ACLU in Kansas because they had added a citizenship question, not a citizenship question, proof of citizenship to their voter ID process. And during the court, this is a great story, during the course of the trial, the ACLU lawyer was questioning one of Kobach's experts on identifying people who were non-citizens. And he said to them, "So can you tell us what your process was?" And the guy said, "Well, we look for foreign-sounding names." And the ACLU lawyer went to his desk, looked something up, and then he came back and he says, "So if I gave you the name," and I don't remember what the name was, but it might have been Armando, Esteban or something, and what would you do with that name? And he said, "We would flag that for removal from the voter checklist." And he goes, the ACLU lawyer says, "Would it surprise you to learn that he's a federal judge on the next floor up in that building?"
How cool. So a race that'll be fun to watch that comes up in about 3 weeks is the 10th district in North Carolina. It comes up on September 10th, Tuesday. The 3rd North Carolina congressional district, and this was the one where the Republican operative went out and he fielded African American absentee ballots. And they'd say, "Well, we haven't finished filling this out." He said, no, just hand it in. We'll finish filling it out for you. And they either voted the blank ones or they trashed the ones that had already been filled out, but for the wrong party. So anyway, they did an investigation. I don't recall what the evidence was that prompted.
There was lots of evidence, including, I think, some witnesses to it that had been paid to go out and go canvass door to door, collecting these absentee ballots from folks and returning them or not returning them.
And so the candidate, interestingly, the Republican candidate's son, for some reason, turned against him in this thing. And that caused the man...
He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer, and I think he felt it was his duty to be truthful.
I see. So they had a primary, and a Republican doctor named Greg Murphy won that primary, and he goes up on September 10th in the 3rd Congressional District in North Carolina against the Democrat named Alan Thomas. And I think it'll be a very interesting bellwether race to look at to see, I suppose, the degree of antipathy, the degree of nausea that the average American voter in a not quite purple state, still a little bit red state of North Carolina, feel about this voter suppression activity of the Republican Party, generally speaking. Tell us about voting machines, Jim. Are they Are the electronic ones trustworthy? You have to certify them. How the devil would you know whether some debolt machine is going to turn every 40th vote Republican? Whether, how do you know how they program these things?
So there is a lot of work that goes on about these things. I think what happened, the best thing is to start with the background. If you go back to the debacle that happened in Florida in 2000, in the Al Gore, George Bush race, what you will find is that they were using some really old flip machines, and you also had to use punch cards where you punched out, and if the punch didn't actually fall off.
Hanging chads.
It's a hanging chad. It could be pressed back in, so it didn't look like it had been voted. So 2002, you had the Help America Vote Act that came out, and along with that was an authorization for Congress to spend up to $3.8 billion with a B dollars for the states to upgrade their equipment. So if you think back, that was 2004 before they appropriated any of that money, and they appropriated 90% of it. At that time, the cat's meow, the best thing since sliced bread was touchscreen technology. And obviously the history we know about that now is that was the worst advice that anybody could have had. Vermont did not go that route. We stayed, we currently have what's called an AccuVote, and all it does is take a paper ballot and read the scan. And then there's a report that comes off of the machine, but we have the paper ballots as well. Those paper ballots are sealed and kept for 22 months in the clerk's vault. We also, within 30 days, I was actually chair of the committee when we instituted audits. We do an audit within 30 days of the general election, usually the last week of November or early December. And the current practice is to do 5% of the towns, and when we get the town's bag of ballots, we do 100% of the ballots in that bag, 100% of the races on that ballot. So we have a pretty good feel for what's gone on around the state, and those are randomly selected. I don't handpick the towns. They're randomly selected towns. The only difference we do is after we randomly select 4, we will then, before we select any others, we look at the demographics and geographics to make sure, because the last thing we would want is 7 districts out of the city of Burlington, because that wouldn't give us a feel for the rest of the state. So we do look at geographics and demographics.
It is completely not related to Vermont, but doesn't New Hampshire have that same system?
They have the same ballot, same, yes. Yeah. Yeah, they do.
So, Jim, yeah.
So just to go a little bit further, so in Vermont, the state law requires any town of 1,000 voters or more to use a optic scan machine, the AccuVote machine. The state pays for it, and we provide the maintenance on it, and the memory cards for those all come through our office. Right now, just to give you a perspective, there's about 135 towns that use tabulators. The other 111 towns hand count. But that 135 towns, which is what, roughly 50%, a little over 50% of the towns, actually represents 80% of the vote. So you can see that it's really the small towns. And we have some towns in Vermont. Victory, the town of Victory only has 72 voters. So, these machines cost $5,000 to $7,000. There's no taxpayer, when I say no taxpayer, no Vermont taxpayer money in them. It's all from our federal money that we got back in the Help America Vote Act. And I just want to add one more thing. I had said to you that 90% of the money had been allocated in 2004. The remaining 10% was allocated in 2018. The reason it was allocated was the states, after the 2016 attacks by Russia, we had been clamoring the legislature, the Congress, to do something, and I had contacted Senator Leahy in December of 2017 and said, you know, you still have 10% of that hanging Chad money that hasn't been authorized, hasn't been appropriated. It was already authorized. It's not going to take an action other than the appropriation. So Senator Leahy hooked up with Senator Klobuchar, Senator Langford, and Senator Burr to move that money through. When I was down testifying before Congress in March of 2018, Senator Burr said, what can we give you as Congress? And I said, well, resources. And he says, it's on the way. That was the first public announcement that money was coming our way. Vermont ended up with $3 million as a result.
How cool. Great story. Thanks. Vermont State Seal proclaims freedom and unity. What can we do to bridge the odious partisan divide? There are so many books right now, like Dog Whistle Politics, how coded racial appeals have reinvented racism and wrecked the middle class, and so on. So what can we do, or what can you do?
Well, I am constantly telling people your vote is your voice. You will see that in a lot of different places on social media. We have a very strong social media process. We actually look at a lot of our Twitter feed is considered to be one of the better ones from sorry, President Trump, but it's the way of reaching people now, and we're using Facebook, we're using Twitter, we're using YouTube, we're using the TV stations, the print media whenever we can. I can't force people to go vote. All I can do is make it so that there's nothing blocking their way, and that's what I strive to do. That's what I work with the legislatures to do, is to take away those obstacles, to make it easier for people to vote, and make it harder to cheat. And we do, our new our new elections management system that we put in place in 2015 was considered one of the best in the country. Our voter checklist now has so many features that we can utilize, so we can check to see if Patsy French all of a sudden registers in Burlington and it's the same birth date and driver's license number, then we can remove you from Randolph. And actually, we don't do it, the clerk does. But we put in place the system. We've kept it at the local level because what we've done is said that the clerks know best their voters. And so when someone registers to vote, it automatically gets sent to the clerk of jurisdiction, and that clerk has to approve it to go up. It shows up on her dashboard the next morning, and she can approve it to go onto the checklist. Or if she looks at it, if she's adding somebody, she can actually say, oh, when she checks the system finds them previously registered in another town in Vermont, and she can forward the message to that clerk, and it's all done automatically. So we've really worked hard to make it as easy as possible for our town clerks to be able to do it, but also to maintain that integrity. I know that on VPR just before the election, my opponent, some of you will know him, Brooke Page, and he got a chance to ask me a question, and he said, I think that Secretary Condos has done a very poor job with the voter checklist. This is right after we were named number one. And he says, and I know this because there are dead people on the voter checklist. So Bob Kinzel turned to me and said, so what do you think, Jim? And I said, well, here's the facts. There will always be dead people on the voter checklist. And I said, we have a problem. dead people don't call us up to tell us to take them off the list. We have to wait until that information gets to us. But we also, I said, if you go across the country, all 50 states have dead people on it. And there's an interesting, I think it was North Carolina or South Carolina, I forget which, there was a few years ago, probably 5 years ago, the Attorney General for one of those states came out, held a big press conference. He found 900 people who were dead and had voted. After, that was big story, CNN.
This is like a Monday Sudoku.
It was a big CNN story and Huffington Post and whatever. And the next thing you know, 2 months later, we find out that 890 of the 900 had voted early and then died. And then the remaining 10, there was no proof that there was no proof of a voter fraud situation. So, but you never heard that story. That story didn't get out there. So, there are so many things. Once your ballot, if you do an early or absentee ballot, the minute you submit it, put it in the mail to the clerk, or the clerk hand it to the clerk, it's there. So it's no longer your ballot. You can't get it back because you want to change your mind. You voted, and it's now in the hands of the clerk to be counted.
Which may be the single biggest deficiency of early voting, is that maybe you've voted before all the information on the candidates are out. Maybe you make a mistake that way. So what?
But in all fairness, in Vermont, about 30% of voters are voting by early ballot. In some states, it's upwards of 50%.
Yeah. So very cool, I think. What's the partisan breakdown between secretaries of state nationally in the 50 states?
It's about 27 to 23, and some of us are, like, I'm elected by the people, some are appointed by the governor or elected by their legislature. So it varies. I think we have, out of the 23 Democrats, I think we have about, I want to say 15 are actually elected. So we have about 8 or 9 that are not. And that's an increase. This time we had 3 increase.
In Maine and New Hampshire, for example, the legislature by secret ballot elects that Secretary of State. In both of those cases, it's a Dem. In New York and Virginia, the secretary is appointed by the governor. So there are about 10 of them altogether. But Jim has right to be proud because he's one of the 9 people in Vermont who run statewide, and that's a big deal.
Well, there's nothing, I don't know the laws of the state of Georgia, and I really doubt that there's anything in the law that would say you can't do this. But I do think on his part there was a real duty, not necessarily to step aside from being secretary, but to step away from the elections part of it. And I think at that point, since he was on the ballot for another seat, I know Brian Kemp, and I know him pretty well. By the way, I don't trust him. Even now they're talking about, because they're under a mandate to change their machines. And supposedly the judge ordered them to do something with a paper ballot, a paper receipt, didn't call it a paper ballot, a paper trail. Let me take it back, paper trail. And what their system is going to be, it's what they call a ballot marking device. So you will still do a touch screen, and then you will be printed like a receipt. And on the receipt, it will list, these are the candidates you voted for. But at the very bottom of that receipt is a barcode, and none of us could read that barcode. We don't know what's in that barcode. Now, this is the one part of me that, I'm a believer in using voter tabulation, because otherwise it would take us forever. But for the record, hand counting of ballots is not the most accurate way to go either. And there's a good example of it here in Vermont. It was the 2006 election. It was Randy Brock, incumbent, Republican auditor, Tom Salmon, Democratic challenger. On election night, Randy Brock won that race by about 120 some odd votes out of 250,000 votes that were cast. Rightfully, Tom Salmon asked for a recount. What it came down to, in the recount, it completely flipped, and Tom Salmon ended up winning that race by about 120 or 130 votes. And what had happened was 15 hand count towns, and we were able to, it was before my time, but we were able to actually determine this. 15 hand count towns, when the clerks had filled in their official return of votes that comes back to the state office for us to calculate everything. Well, there were 3 candidates. There was a Libertarian candidate in there, or Liberty Union candidate, and he was in the middle. And so it was, I forget, I think it was Brock, Levy, Salmon. Levy in those 15 hand count towns got 0 votes. But when the clerks filled out their return of votes, they missed the box. And they put the Democratic votes in the Levy box, not the Democratic box. 15 of those towns, that's what happened. So you have to be careful. The human eye, as good as it is, it's not all that good, especially when it gets tired.
Jim, what's the chemistry between the two parties at NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State, given that it appears to be a sort of organized effort among Republicans not to embrace new voters or voters of color or whatever? How do they, the Secretary of State's supposed to be in charge of fair elections?
Well, first, not all secretaries of state have elections under them. You mentioned Virginia. In Virginia, it's actually, there's a board of elections, and it's like that in other places as well. Secondly, I would say that we do our best when we have our subcommittee or our committees. We have a committee on elections, on a presidential primary, on voter participation, on cybersecurity, on business services, on state heritage, which is our state museums and archives. Every committee that we have has both a Republican and Democratic co-chair. Our executive committee, we try to balance as much as we can. The president, we alternate every year the presidency, so the president is a Democrat last year, this year it's a Republican, next year it'll be a Democrat. And so we alternate, and the president is the one that gets to pick who they have as their executive committee. So we do try to work together. We try to stay away from controversial stuff because, like in resolution forms, we stay away from stuff because the party that has the numbers can pretty much do whatever they want. And we had several occasions over the last 10 years where that occurred, where the Republicans, when the Tea Party Republicans came in, they really tried to ramrod a bunch of stuff. But what saved us was some of the old guard Republicans who refused to go along with these young guys that wanted to change the world. And it was, Bill Gardner is a Democrat, but he's one of the old guard. He's been there since the 70s. But, there was Sam Reed from state of Washington. There was Delbert Hosemann from Mississippi. There were just Al Yeager from North Dakota. You know, there were a bunch of these old, 3 or 4 older, seasoned, reasoned Republicans who refused to go along with this move to try to politicize our organization. We pride ourselves, the National Association of Secretaries of State prides itself on being the oldest nonpartisan government-supported commission, if you want to call it, association.
That's cool. So in the backdrop, you've got Moscow Mitch McConnell acts as if he welcomes another round of Russian hacking. As Mark McDonald asked me yesterday, if you were Putin, which states would you focus on? And what is the reaction of your Republican secretaries of state? Are they worried about the hacking? Are they taking preventative measures? And finally, what measures have you taken to make sure Vermonters don't elect Putin this round?
Do we have the whole night?
Yeah, now you can do it.
So, 2016, Secretary Jay Johnson of Department of Homeland Security called all the secretaries of state. It was in August of 2016 to a conference call to inform us that they had evidence that the Russians, well, they didn't know it was the Russians then. That came out later. That we were being attacked by a foreign adversary, and they were considering making us election systems being a critical infrastructure like utilities, water systems, sewage systems, electric systems. So they were considering that. I remember I said to them, please understand how our systems work before you decide to do something. And I referenced the fact that elections by design are decentralized to each state. Each state then parcels it up to their counties. Like, we have no county government really, but you go west of New England and a lot of county government. But each state has different ways that they do it. We go straight from the state level to the town level. And what we've been doing since, they named us a critical infrastructure in January of 17, we've been working closely. So let me just explain the communication level that we have now, which, by the way, before 2016, we had no communication, period, between states or between us and the federal partners. Now we have total conversations going on, meetings. We have what's called a governing coordinating council, which I'm a member. I was one of the original members, which is made up of state, local, federal, and county officials. And we have an election infrastructure, what's called ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center. We have, from the Department of Homeland Security, we have what's called an Albert monitor, which sits off to the side of our internet pipe coming into our office and basically reads IP addresses all day long. We get scanned tens of thousands of times a day, people trying to get in. We have been working hard prior to 2016, but really stepped it up after 2016 to put more defenses in place. We were the ones that had contacted Homeland Security and the FBI, I know the date, August 24th last year, to notify them that we had, through our logs of our firewalls, we had detected several attempts with an IP address located in the Russian Federation or the Ukraine. So we notified DHS and the FBI and the Center for Internet Security. Within 24 hours or 36 hours, they sent out a nationwide alert to be on the lookout for these addresses. We have a system in place now that we didn't have prior to 2016. We have, on election day, all 50 states are tied into what's called an election day threat dashboard. Essentially, it's an internet dashboard where we can see what's occurring elsewhere in the country. and we can put information in, they can put information in. But it's a real-time dashboard that allows us to understand and react quickly. My IT folks are on that all day long on election day. We have, in my view, the simplest, most non-technological best practice, a paper ballot. And it's a voter-marked paper ballot. And we do the post-election audits. We do our voter registration database. By the way, the voter registration database, it is backed up every night. So if someone were to get in, let's say tonight, and destroy the database, delete it, we would just go back 24 hours, reset it. We would only lose 24 hours worth of data. And on top of that, we have the other point of resiliency, which our legislature gave us the authority to do, and that is same-day voter registration. Now, let me just say one thing about the voter registration. Prior to 2016, and including 2016, our voter registration was about 80 to 90% done by walk into the town clerk's office, submit a form over the download the copy of the form from our website, fill it out, and mail it to your town clerk, or voter registration drives, 80 to 90%. Today, 75% of the voter registrations that we receive are through our online voter registration portal, through automatic voter registration, and through same-day voter registration. In this past election, which was the first general election with same-day voter registration, I know there were people saying, well, nobody's going to really use it. Statewide, we had over 8,000 people that registered to vote on election day.
What percentage was that?
So that's probably about 8 or 9% of the total voter registration for that year.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay, here are a few rapid fire, just to finish up. I have a favorite political book.
I have a question. I'll wait till that.
You go ahead, okay.
I'm a former elementary and high school teacher, not in this state, unfortunately, but somewhere else. Has the Vermont Secretary of State's office designed and implemented a curriculum for elementary and/or high schools to help develop critical thinking skills to ensure an informed and engaged future generations?
That's a great question.
We have two people in here who are probably under 40.
So the question is, has the Secretary of State's office created a curriculum for elementary, middle, and high schools to help educate our kids on basically our democracy and voting, right? So the answer is yes. In fact, we still use many of Deb Markowitz's stuff that she had really focused on that. My focus now is on getting this. Once we got to this point, we had to completely redo pretty much everything in the office, and we're now starting to look at how we can update and upgrade those books and stuff. We've had schools, unfortunately, a lot of the schools don't request my presence to come present to them, but I have done it on many occasions where I go to a school and I have a presentation for third graders, I have a presentation for eighth graders, and one for high school. And a lot of times with the high school, we do actually do voter registration at the same time. I also participate every year in Girls State and Boys State. This year blew me away with how many kids were ready to register to vote. Just blew me away. In the past, we would be lucky to get 10 to 15. There'd be about 100 on the Boys State, and we'd be lucky to get 10 or 15 that would register. And then Girls State, there's about 85 to 90 that show up there, and we'd be lucky to get 10 or 12. This year, between the two of them, I think it was close to 75. So our kids are engaged, our youth are engaged, and I'm really pleased about that. And I can't tell you how many times I get someone comes up to me, you probably don't remember me, they're 5 years later, You don't remember me, but you signed me up to vote, back when I was at Boy State or Girl State.
Very cool. Do you have a favorite political, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if I could maybe piggyback off that question. So you've been talking a lot about how the ways you've tried to shore up like the direct meddling on election day with the systems. But it seems like in a lot of the revelations about like Cambridge Analytica and a lot of these more social media centered campaigns to influence voter turnout, I mean, that's not like a blatant violation of the voting infrastructure. I'm just curious from your position, do you have any opinion on that or comment? I mean, do you feel sanguine still about the legitimacy of the upcoming elections, given that there's so much sort of targeted, data-driven campaigning? And does your office have any interaction with that? You mentioned like a Facebook presence.
So, So the question again was about social media influence. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And we try to tell people, and we're going to even beef it up even more so this coming election next year, with Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, trying to tell people that think before you link. And link before, think before you link and send, because you don't, that's the problem. And the real problem that we have with social media influence, is that once something is posted, it could be seen by millions of people before we get a chance to get it taken down. And that's a real problem. The thing we have done through my national association while I was president was opened up channels with both Facebook and Twitter. So we now have a direct pipeline to them. They both handled it a little bit differently. Facebook gave us, as Secretaries of State, a direct portal to go to complain about something. Twitter wants us to funnel it through our association, so they're only getting it from one location. But it's a different way. We told them after 18 that really doesn't work well, so we're working on trying to improve it for 2020. But it's a huge problem. We're telling people over and over again, go to your trusted source for information. One of the things that we saw, we didn't see it here in Vermont, but your polling place, this polling place is closed because of a power outage. But don't worry about the 7 o'clock deadline, it's going to be open until 10 o'clock. Well, that's not true. Or Republicans vote on Tuesdays, Democrats vote on Wednesdays. That's not true either. So, there are things that are obvious that we can deal with. You will often find me on through our Facebook page or our Twitter page. Not me, I don't manage. They won't give me access to my Twitter page, my staff. They're afraid I'm going to become like somebody else that uses Twitter a lot. But we do try to make sure we correct things when we see it. It's a real problem. I know, Bob, you've actually asked me, is this true? Through a Facebook page or something. So it is an issue I think that we have to pay attention to, because what's happening is the Russians realized that they couldn't get in and change votes. To change a vote here in Vermont, to change a vote, you would have to break into the town hall, break into the town clerk's office, break into the town clerk vault, find the memory card, change it, and then get out without anybody noticing it. And for how many people? How many votes? You'd have to have an army of people across the country to really make any impact. So they have gone to looking at the one state that was breached was Illinois, and it was their voter registration database. So many of us have gone to shoring up even more so our voter registration databases. We're learning from others as to the best solutions. We've got a real solid communications point with our Department of Homeland Security. And trust me, yes, they work for the president, but the folks in there are career professionals, and they're doing what they can. They provide us lots of services, lots of resources. We have, from the Department of Homeland Security, we have a weekly cyber hygiene scan, which means that they check our system weekly and send us a report as to if they found any vulnerabilities or whatever. Because you don't know if someone left the door open or a window open last week. So that's what they're doing. And we've been doing that since 2016, prior to the election in 16. Essentially, a lot of these scans that you hear about, and you'll hear about it from everybody, that we're scanned tens of thousands of times, some places are millions of times. But what it is a scan is like someone coming up to your door in the middle of the night and trying the doorknob to see if the door's unlocked, going to the window and looking in to see if there's something that they can go in and get. And that's what a scan is, basically, I mean, to put it in layman's terms. So we're really trying to shore up any way we possibly can. We do penetration testing, we do vulnerability and risk assessments, once a year, a vulnerability and risk assessment. Penetration testing, we do it periodically, where we actually hire professional hackers, white hat hackers, to try to get into our system, and then they tell us what they found, if they did. So there's lots of things that we're doing nationwide, and this is both Republicans and, I think for the most part, Republicans and Democrats are taking this seriously. There are other things that we, in terms of what the Republicans believe, but that's another thing.
Jim, you've given us a lot of thoughtful answers we're well over an hour now. I've got probably 40 more questions, but we're going to have to let them go till the next time we meet at a bar or whatever. But I want to, there's one thing that's on a lot of people's mind right now that I just want to conclude with before we thank you and give you a little present. The Michael Cohen, in his final remarks to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence or Government Oversight, said that Donald Trump isn't going to go quietly. And Donnie Deutsch, on his Saturday night MSNBC program 2 weeks ago, uttered about the same thing. Deutsch knows Trump from way back, and now has a very entertaining 8 p.m. Saturday night program on MSNBC. And his question to his panel was, or it was more an assertion that, maybe even better, I'm going to read you an op-ed concluding paragraph from 2 weeks ago in the Valley News called The Politics of Conspiracy. And in this piece, written by Randall Ballmer, who teaches at Dartmouth College, he says, look at all the conspiracy theories that are prevalent out there right now, and he cites 10 of them and says, I'm not a conspiracist, but his final paragraph is, in the spirit of conspiracy, I'll close with my own conspiracy theory, one that I've repeated since Election Day 2016, and anybody who listen. Actually, it's not so much a conspiracy as an awful premonition. I fear that even if Trump is defeated in the presidential election 2020, he'll refuse to leave office. He'll cry fraud, fake news, and hunker down, insisting he really did win the election, all credible evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. I have little doubt that Sean Hannity and the sycophants at Fox News will join the chorus, demanding that Trump remain in office. That, in turn, will create a constitutional crisis, especially with a lapdog Senate and a judiciary of Trump's own making. Such a scenario might eventually involve the military, which constitutionally is under the control of the commander-in-chief. I shudder at the prospect, and if that speculation makes me a conspiracist, I suppose I must take my place alongside the anti-fluoride Cabell. So this is a pretty gloomy, awful thing, but what protection have we against that premonition?
There was also an article in the last couple of days by Scaramucci, who was his 10-day director of communications at one point, and he says, the Mooch says that President Trump will resign in March of 2020 because he's going to realize by then that he really can't win and that he's not going to stick it out because he doesn't like to lose. So it's kind of interesting. God help us all if it comes to that, what you just described. I really think that the adults in the room will hopefully stand up. I believe, frankly, I really do believe, as bad as the Senate has been, if he tried to do that, the Senate would stand up. I can't believe that they would go along with that. I really can't.
I wouldn't stake my life on that.
I'm not staking my life, but you know, I think there are enough of the old guard that are in there that they're well, that's it. They're nowhere now, and I think they're being pushed aside. But I do think that if he tries to take over the country and basically stay as president, even though he loses, you know, when you think about what happened in the last couple of days, the Federal Elections Commission chair wrote a letter to the president and his campaign, basically saying that you know, if you've got proof of voter fraud, it's time to show it. Put up or shut up. And you know, he was in New Hampshire this past week talking about how he really should have won or did win New Hampshire even though he lost. And there's been no proof. He did this about California, no proof. He's done this in other states as well. There's been no proof. And I think that he's really, I just don't understand why these folks are not standing up and stopping this crap.
Judges.
Frankly. Well, that's the scary part. Yeah, this is the lesser of two evils. Put the judges in place.
But they haven't had any courage up till now. Why would they have courage at that point?
As serious as it is now, I think that is probably the most serious situation that this country would really go into a nosedive.
Oh, absolutely.
Question.
I think there would be blood in the streets.
Oh, I think so.
I would even be concerned if he loses the election. What's the transition going to be like if he does?
Oh, God, yeah.
Can you imagine
Well,
how
he's already not there.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you'd have to go to Bedminster and find him out on the 16th hole.
Right.
I
Yeah,
guess.
I don't know. I mean, you know, Larry Kudlow was on TV this morning, his economic advisor, saying there's no recession.
Oh, he's an idiot.
You know, even though everybody is saying all the indicators are there for a recession, he's saying, no, there's no recession. We don't see it.
Jim, you're chomping.
Couple of thoughts in answer to the sort of general question, how do we get out of this mess? I'm kind of paraphrasing. I read an article just within the last 24 hours about artificial intelligence. And as artificial intelligence, and as we know, it can be used to generate false stories, deep falsehood or whatever they're called, and other kind of stuff like that. But there are people in various places working very, very hard to do the opposite, to scan thousands. Your computers now can scan thousands or even millions of feeds and separate fact from fiction and provide good information to journalists if they choose to use it. And that is well, we know what's out there, Russians and whatnot and whatever, but the fact that there are people working so hard to get it right and to essentially, among other things, this information could be used to rebuild journalism from the inside out, separate fact from fiction and provide good stuff that can be then put into good stories. That's on one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is what's going to stop this horrendous onslaught on democracy from continuing to happen. Stand up.
No, speak up.
Sorry. What's going to... I'm almost done, Mark, by the time you get that. What's gonna... The other end of the scale is, on the small end of the scale, the individual end of the scale. I'm remembering a time when Bobby Kennedy was campaigning for one campaign or another, describing of the good stuff that his administration, would do. And someone stood up and said, "Senator, who's going to pay for all of this?" And he looked at the person right straight in the eye and he said, "You are," meaning you, all of us. The way this turns around is, who's going to stop this bullshit? And the answer is, we are. One at a time, collectively.
Yeah.
I mean, that's serious. We can decry what's going on and we can ask someone else to fix it, but really it comes down to us.
That's right.
So we got the biggest scale in the world, artificial intelligence trying to sort things out, and we've got all the people in the room here, one at a time, two at a time, whatever you like. So that's what I was thinking to say.
So I you're right, and I think there would be a tremendous uprising. The question is what happens, how does he respond? I just hope that whatever happens, I hope that the election is so decisive that there's a message there. And that he understands. I hope, and that means the Senate flipping over to the Democrats and a strong popular vote. This guy does not like to lose. He doesn't like to lose to women. I think that we got to do everything we can. That's why you talk about voter registration and getting people out to vote. GOTV, get out the vote, is going to be the key to this next election. Is making sure that all those Democrats that didn't vote last time, or voted for a third party because they didn't like Hillary. We've got to get people out to vote. That's the one thing that we have. That is the basis of our democracy. That is what we defend. That's what our soldiers are defending across the world. Is that? That's why I, as a Secretary of State, are working hard to defend the integrity of our elections, to defend our democracy all around. And it's and I think most of my colleagues, if not all, are doing the same.
Thank you very much.